Greetings, traveller. Your arrival is timely, for there have been yet more whispers from the world that was. Welcome to Old World News. So, what news do we have for you this week? Well, it is very much in the vein of this article on Warhammer Community. And we're going to start taking with the impending arrival of Warhammer The Old World in just a few months' time. And I'm starting to believe that actually might be the case, considering they're starting to ramp up now with a quick look at how the turns and the phases go and some of the rules therein. So this article, the Old World Almanac, was released yesterday, and aside from that beautiful picture of the Elven line tackling a horde of goblin wolf riders in something highly reminiscent of the Battle of the Last Alliance from the Fellowship of the Ring film, we've got some really interesting stuff below. We're seeing something about the game structure. Now this is great, because this is where we really see how they've been developing this game and how familiar it's going to be to us, because as they have said right here in the game structure section, that Warhammer The Old World is a new game designed from the ground up to simulate large regiments meeting in combat, as volleys of arrows and artillery shots soar overhead, cavalry, wizards, heroes and monsters crash into combat all around. It also says, though, that it's not to say that it's not taken plenty of inspiration from several editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and that is the most important thing, because that is what we all want. We're all looking at this, hopefully, as a new edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, something that has been missing from our lives, sadly, for many years now. So what we've got is the turn sequence, and right off the bat we have got a whole new phase right at the start, and one phase missing. We have got a strategy phase which sits just in front of the movement phase and does appear to be an expanded part of the old start of turn sub-phase. It seems to be a case of certain things that set up the turn will happen here, so it'll be things such as checking for animosity, or as they mention here, stupidity. In fact, they have their own start of turn phase right at the top here, but the rest of the phase seems to be an expansion of that. So it is a case of testing for stone troll stupidity, seeing if night goblins turn up, any special actions or tests. If I was to look at this in terms of Magic the Gathering, this is your upkeep. This is the start of turn where you perform any actions that have to happen before the actual turn itself gets started. And this seems to be, this sub-phase anyway, seems to be pretty much lifted, even so much as they use the same phrase here. Where is it? You may also use this period to tidy the table, removing any stray casualties and errant dice. Now, if we look at the 8th edition rulebook here, and page, I think it's page 25. Page 15. Sorry. Here we go. So it's exactly the same. It's worth using this as a tide break or breathing space between one turn and the next, where you can remove any stray casualties, errant dice, and all the other bits of gaming detritus that builds up on the battlefield as the game goes on. So they're not wrong, they are borrowing heavily from the old rulebooks, in some cases so far as to just copying word for word text from the old book. But again, if it works, it works, and that's good. So this phase it's essentially just the prep. This sub-phase, the start of turn, is almost as it always was, but they've expanded that now, because now, moving on, we have a command sub-phase, and this is where you fire off character special rules. So they have an example here, and our first example of an enchanted item, the Falcon Horn of Friedmund. And during the combat sub-phase of their turn, if the character wielding this is not engaged in combat, the character may attempt to use the Falcon Horn of Friedmund by taking a leadership test. And I think from what it suggests that leadership tests are still 2d6, roll under your leadership and you are fine. But if it passes, until the start of your next start of turn phase, enemy units cannot use the fly special rule. Now, considering that flight is a huge part of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I'm thinking great eagles, I am thinking the dragons, of which there are many, wyverns, the Bretonians themselves with their Pegasus knights. If you control the skies for a whole turn, what an advantage that will be. So assume that there will be similar options, if not denying flight, but denying certain aspects of opponents' abilities that you can try and launch with your magic items in this phase, this command phase. Then I think that's got some real legs to adding lots of variety to your gameplay, because obviously if you manage to lock that down for a turn, you're going to have such board advantage if the opponent relies on swift flyers and is trying to flank you, and all of a sudden they are at their walking speed, and the walking speed of a great eagle is nothing compared to its flight speed. So all of a sudden you're going to be able to keep your formation in a stronger position without worrying about being flanked or indeed hit in the rear, and having all of the negative penalties that go with that. So certainly an interesting phase, and I'd be interested to see what all the other races have got when it comes to this. What can you give your leaders and your characters that can really mess with the opponent from the off? The other thing that we are missing, and is mentioned here, is that there is no magic phase anymore. We go straight from the command phase through to, or the strategy phase, sorry, through to movement, shooting, and combat. There is no magic phase. Magic now is split between the phases, and it's mentioned here that after the command phase, there is a conjuration phase, and this is where wizards on your side will try and either bless, or what do they call it, enchant, which will give buffs to your unit, or cast hexes, which will give debuffs to your opponent's units. And it's something that if you've played the Total War Warhammer games, actually works really well. Seeing it en masse when a cloud descends upon your opponents and all of a sudden they start swinging wildly and missing, or when you cast some enchantment to boost the armor and endurance of your own units, and you stand there and watch as your spearmen hold the line against 3 times their number of rampaging orcs. It's a really useful thing to have. And so having it so that you start your turn, you've denied the flyers with your magic item, and then not only that, but you buff your archers so that they can take a real advantage of winnowing the enemy unit right in front before your knights come in from the sides and crush them. I like that a lot. But again, it depends on your race, and it depends on, I suppose, what spells are available to you, what schools of magic you're able to cast from, and whether or not you're a dwarf who has nothing. So we'll see how it goes. But it's interesting. And again, we get a spell here, which is great. We get an example of a Tomb King's spell from the Law of Nehekara. Jaff's Incantation of Cursed Blades. With a casting value of 7+. Now we'll have to look into this, because it does say that more detail on magic and casting values in another article. So obviously, as these articles drop, we're going to make new videos, either Gaz or myself. But in this one, so this is an enchantment, which is a buff for your own troops. Casting value 7+, range of self. So until your next start of turn subphase, any friendly unit that has an Echoran Undead special rule that is within the caster's command range may re-roll any rolls to hit of a natural 1. So that's always handy. Re-rolling ones is useful, but rather than it being a constant aura, I do like the fact that it is a spell. You're not just walking around with this permanently on buff that helps everyone. That's one of my issues, and has always been one of my issues with modern 40k, is the number of buffs and auras that characters have, because keeping track of it is a nightmare. Or at least this way, forcing you to activate it with a roll, or with a success or fail chance at the start of a turn, means that everyone's aware of what's going on. You don't just listen to the person say, oh, I've got to reroll for hits, reroll for wounds, and I ignore any so-and-sos, and 6s give me extra hits. So this is really good. I like this a lot, and I assume This seems like a very... obviously, it's got its own name, Jaff's Incantation of Cursed Blades, but I assume every race is going to have something similar, where you can buff your units within command range to have a reroll of some kind, or maybe a +1 to hit, or +1 to wound, or, your armor value goes up by 1. It will depend on the race, but there will be a range of buffs that you're going to be able to choose from and attempt to cast in this range. Again, unless you're dwarfs, unless you've got a rune priest, I suppose. But it is nice to see that they are folding this in so that magic is, rather than just having its own phase where magic was unwieldy and could go off against you as much as it could go off against the enemy, it's great to see that it is now integral to the whole turn sequence. So if we scroll back up here and have a quick look at this turn sequence again, as there's no magic phase, you can see on every part of it, it explains where magic is involved. So the strategy phase is enchantment and hex spells. The movement phase is conveyance spells, which is great. So it's shifting, boosting your units forward, or potentially moving your opponent's units further away. The shooting phase has magic missile and magical vortex spells, and everybody loves a magical vortex, something moving across the battlefield, just taking out dozens of miniatures as it goes. And then the combat phase, there are assailment spells. Now, I assume this is close quarter wizardry, not so much fighting, but just casting about, keeping people away from you, magical spears to run through someone who's trying to take you on. Again, there'll be a lot of variety. I hope it's still got that, maybe not hundreds and hundreds of spells as there were, but enough that every battle's going to have different uses for different spells, and so you're not always just going to see the same conveyance spell, the same enchantment, the same hex. I want there to be lots and lots of different spells, and I think that is something that there's enough background there that they can pick and choose wisely and make this so that there will be really innovative uses of magic throughout the whole turn. But yeah, so magic in the turn looks good, but then the final step is, again, it's a classic Warhammer feature, and that's just to rally your fleeing troops, and again, 2 dice against its leadership characteristic, which is what I mentioned earlier. So 2 dice, roll under your leadership, chance of rallying. Obviously that gets harder if your unit is under half strength with -1 leadership, and I do like that it gets even harder if you are under 25%. These people are not in any circumstances of wanting to come back, and so you've got to roll yourself a double 1. You're going to get the snake eyes on your leadership test to have a chance of bringing this unit back. Otherwise, they're off. So yeah, it's the first look at the rules. It's the first look at the first part of a turn. We still don't know much about force composition. We do not know if there is a stat line yet. We don't know what the stat line is, but I sorely hope the stat line is similar to how it used to be, because for me, again, coming back to 40k in sort of 8th and 9th edition, I was just... the initiative value, for starters, something which determines the order in which people go in combat after charging, for me has always been an integral rule. It might be because I played high elves to start with and I had a high initiative value and therefore got to swing first. You know, it's a small thing, but it gives a huge meaning to the fact that an elf is naturally quicker than an orc or a human, and again, that humans tend to be quicker than orcs, even though orcs tend to be tougher. And so I want there to be that classic movement, weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, toughness, wounds, initiatives, attacks, and leadership. If that stat line for me has always been integral, and like 10th edition 40k has done away with that. It's gone its own way and it seems to work, but it still doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't feel like it's comfortable, whereas this is like putting an old coat on. It's warm, it's good, you know everything about it, you know it's going to do the job, and I want to see that. I want to see initiative-based combat. I want to see regiments, because again, with regiments, it's a more complex thing than individual models in a skirmish. This is massed armies. I want there to be... I don't want it to be, oh, it's my turn, so you go first, or it's your turn, so I go first. I want there to be each turn, who are the most nimble people? They get their swings in first. And if you're paying more points per model for that, as often the case with, say, high elves again, and their units being more expensive than the equivalent human, then so be it. That is the advantage you're paying for. So, anyway, until the next one of these, I think it's a good time to leave this. Please do leave us a like and a subscribe, because this is ramping up now, and I expect there to be articles almost weekly up until release date now. If we're looking at every feature of this, and I assume we're going to have 3 more articles on the turn sequence, we'll then have more in-depth features on army building, and probably a feature on magic on its own right, because magic is now integral to the whole system. So there's going to be plenty going on up to Christmas and beyond. Please stay with us, like us, subscribe us, share with your friends, and if I've missed anything or I have talked absolute nonsense, leave me a comment down below and I will apologise to you. Until then, take care.